This is the Philanthropy Show, connecting and inspiring philanthropy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Louanne Saraga Walters, and this is a very special edition of the Philanthropy Show. For those of you who remember the show, we are bringing it out of retirement in these uncertain times. Sharon and I just felt like we have a platform, we have it available, and this is how we can be of service to you. We really wanted to serve both the nonprofits who are trying to work with their constituents, both internal and external, and foundations who are looking for means of handling this most unusual and unique time that we've ever really faced in the nonprofit sector. You know, the Philanthropy Show was designed to educate, uplift, and empower nonprofit employees, board members, donors, and volunteers. And this is a great way to do that. We have the opportunity, and the intention of this show is really threefold. One, we want to take a look at the unusual needs right now in the nonprofit sector and what those local communities are looking at and what they're really facing. We have a wonderful survey that was conducted by one of those local organizations. We wanted to look at resources that would be available for nonprofits that are tangible. They're ever changing. This is a completely new time. And we want to hear from a national leader who's also right at the cutting edge of what grant makers are doing. What are these foundations looking at? Their challenges that are very unique as well. So as I host, I will serve to lead the discussion and move it along, but really you're going to be hearing today from three amazing people that I've had the opportunity now, Sharon and I, to know for several years, and it's my pleasure to introduce them and welcome them back to the show. Starting with, right below me, is Emily Benham. You can wave up. This is kind of like the Brady Bunch, right? She is the CEO of the Nonprofit Leadership Center of Tampa Bay. It is one of 10 management support organizations in Florida, and there are hundreds of those nationwide. Probably you have them in your state as well. Acting as a resource hub for nonprofits through trainings and certifications, conferences and webinars, and like today, special surveys that really reach out to take the pulse of nonprofits. Emily was also our very first guest on the Philanthropy Show years ago in 2015. And the NLC, the Nonprofit Leadership Center, was our studio sponsor back when we had the green screen set up. So thank you, Emily. Thanks for coming back and joining us today.
Happy to be here, Louanne. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. And Beth Kanter, many of you know Beth. She is a well-established international thought leader. She is a leader trainer. She's a blogger. She's an author. She just has stopped international traveling for now, although she's an amazing resource worker. She's also put together with a group of colleagues this fantastic document, or I guess it's a document of resources on Google Docs, and she's really going to deep dive into that for us and see how that meets the needs that we're looking at right now. Welcome, Beth. Nice to have you back.
Great to be back. Thank you so much. You
betcha. And Dave Biemesderfer, who is actually to my, if you're looking at the screen, to my left or to my right, if I turn to say, hey, Dave. He's the president and CEO of United Philanthropy Forum, which is based out of Washington, although he's currently in St. Petersburg. This is a membership organization made up of 84 national and regional philanthropy-serving organizations that together then represent over 7,000 foundations and funders nationwide. Dave previously held positions at the Minnesota Council on Foundations and the Florida Philanthropic Network, where he was president and CEO. He's also a former guest of the show, and he was the very first person to volunteer as a member of our advisory council for the show, and we're very honored to have you back and have your knowledge available as well. Thank you, Dave, for joining us.
Thank you, Louanne. Wonderful to be here.
Okay, as I said, I am just going to be kind of helping to orchestrate this discussion and pull us through this really complex web that we found ourselves in. You know, I'm one of those nonprofit employees who is now on furlough. I've been fortunate to be able to work with an organization in Denver, but like many organizations nationwide, we're going, what do we do? How do we answer this time of crisis? How do we serve our constituents, and how do we also serve those employees? So, Emily, let me start with you first. And through the magic of Zoom, I'm going to be kind of referring back to our browser, which has linked information, and then also this on-screen as we can. So thank you to Zoom for providing that ability. But let's talk about this survey that you did. And tell us what those 6 main concerns were that you found.
Happy to, Louanne. So, little background on the survey. We reached out to funders early on as this situation was developing to see what their questions were. What did they want to know from their nonprofits? Part of our role is really that nexus of collaboration, so bringing what the funders were looking for in an efficient way for the nonprofits to provide that information when we know their every minute is spent adapting and changing. So we completed that survey about a week ago, and the top concerns, we approached it from a couple different ways. What are the concerns of the people the nonprofits are serving? What are the concerns of the nonprofits? And what can we do to support them, and what can funders do? So the top concerns, those 6 concerns you mentioned, are the concerns of the clients. So the people they're serving, primarily the people that respond to this were CEOs of social service agencies. So the concerns of the clients are fairly universal. I would say job loss and financial security being number 1. Doesn't really matter what sector you work in. That's a big one. Then access to basic necessities, food, housing, healthcare, things like that. Third was mental health. That with increased isolation and a population already marginalized, the mental health component of what nonprofits can add was a big concern. Next was educating and caring for their children. Many families are caring for their children at home. We have a college-age child, young man, I should say, here in our house who's doing an exam right now, doing his accounting exam right now. And then medical care. People are concerned about, what if I catch the virus? How am I going to be able to do what I do and provide for my family? And lastly, and I'm so glad this is going to be addressed on this during this hour, is navigating all of the communications that are out there. There's so much information, and it can be hard to navigate. We heard from one of our nonprofits this week that especially for audiences that have English as a second language, some of this doesn't translate literally and figuratively in terms of culture. So they may not understand. So they're doing a series of webinars in different languages to get out to their people to help them understand what exactly this means. So those are our big takeaways in terms of what nonprofits are seeing in their community as a result of this survey.
You know, there really is no time like this in history where we've had so many different fronts that are urgent. Those 6 things that you just listed, each one of those is an urgent front for a nonprofit trying to continue to serve these communities that are very much in need. I mean, these items that you're talking about, medical, everything is so important about. So let's break this into, let me turn over to Beth for a moment and say, Beth, of those 6 that we just talked about, and we're going to really dive into the COVID-19 communications in just a second. But what I want to ask you is kind of in a broad way, of those 6, where can people go? Was that the intention behind the creation that you did for this Google Docs?
Yes. I actually started the Google Doc myself 6 weeks ago because I was following what was happening, and I was just like trying to organize information for myself because I was sort of like feeling paranoid about it. Yeah, 6 weeks ago when people weren't as worried, and so what's the CDC? What's the CDC site? Where's the maps? Which one? And also, where is the valid information that's from valid sources? Because there's also a lot of misinformation out there.
Good point.
And then progressively, as we, in different states, and then on, I think March 11th it was when it was declared a pandemic. Then all of a sudden there was this everybody was like, where do I go? Where's the information? And so I just put my Google Doc out there and said, with edit privileges for everybody, add your category, add your resource. Because it reminded me of the really early days of social media in 2003, 2004, when Katrina hit. And at that point, there weren't, social media in a disaster wasn't sort of is like it is now, having set processes, and there was a lot of improvisation, and a lot of people were setting up these structures for people to add their resources really quickly. And so then that helped me, because then I could step back and be the Google Doc gardener.
Yeah. So let me ask you, as the Google Doc gardener, I love that, and I'm going to go ahead and put this up as a share as well. So just so that everybody understands, number one, we will be sharing these links in the YouTube discussion section, so that you can access them as well. You can see them. I'm listing them right up here. Well, that's a lot, but here it is. bit.ly/NP-COVID-19 to get to. But also Emily's survey. I'm sure that there have been surveys conducted in your communities or in your states as well. And I'd love to have some conversations around those and how similar those are. But Beth, walk us through just how we would read this. I see on the left-hand side, you've got an awful lot of tabs and whatnot. So how can people access this document to find what they need without having to try to figure the whole thing out?
Okay, so it's massive. It just kept on growing, and I kept on going in and reorganizing things and putting categories. And then we put a table of contents in if you scroll down, and each one of those categories is clickable. So that will jump you to the place in the document. And I have another, actually a volunteer came along and said, you need a table of contents because it's getting too long. And they put this in, and they actually showed me how to do it in Google. I was so proud of myself. Now I know how to do table of contents in Google Docs. Who knew I would ever need it?
Wow, this is amazing.
Originally I had it set, everybody could edit. I had so many people in the Google document, nobody could do anything. So I set it to view only, and I put a note up if you want to share something, request privileges. And so I go in every so often and just go through it and see if things have been miscategorized, or if there's a whole bunch of new topics that need a separate place. Like, for example, we were just talking about the CARE Act information and webinars, and mentioning that it's changing so fast that those are out of date. So I quickly changed and said, check back with these organizations.
Yes.
Originally I had links to the webinars from a few days ago, was it already?
Yeah, I know.
And now that's out of date.
So that's what I just want to say to folks who are going to access this document is to, look over here on the left, make sure that you look at the table of contents like Beth was talking about if you really want to try to find something more specific. Her breaking news section right at the top is going to be about what is because this is changing so much. It's what is really pertinent at this time, which let's jump into that then. In a pre-discussion right before this recording, we were talking about some of the things that are going on right now, and Emily brought up the SB 7A, which is what everybody is trying to, through the CARES Act, how do I apply, how do I get? So Emily, let me turn this over to you, and then for each of you to kind of highlight that. What is this? What's been your experience? Dave, if you would then also speak a little bit about your knowledge of it and how it's translating, and then Beth keeping us kind of wrapping that section up with what they can look for in this. So Emily, let me turn it over to you.
Sure, Louanne, I'm happy to comment on that. And full disclosure, I certainly don't consider myself an expert, but the NLC did apply early on for two reasons, both for help for us from the Paycheck Protection Program, but also so that we could lead for the sector and be able to report back to others what our experience was and help them prepare. So we jumped right in on Friday morning. We established a relationship with our bank prior to that. I understand those relationships are changing hourly, so that was difficult for nonprofits to establish that relationship, but we were fortunate in doing it. I guess my major takeaways from it is that it is, while certainly wonderful to have the opportunity, it is difficult for nonprofits because you're following many constraints in the application that are meant for for-profits. And there's screens that you can't advance beyond unless you ask questions which really don't apply to nonprofits. So that was my biggest takeaway. I think that, again, we are fortunate in that we were able to complete it but it was probably, I've applied for a lot of grants in my day. This is probably one of the most difficult, not necessarily for the information they needed, but for the method in which the questions they asked and the methods you had to respond.
Mm-hmm.
So I worry for its inaccessibility for many nonprofits, and we are partnering with others and curating resources daily to help people access it.
Wow. Well, so Dave, have you had kind of a similar feedback on this SB 7A?
Yeah, absolutely. And like Emily, my organization, along with a number of our national policy colleagues, we were advocating for nonprofit inclusion in the CARES Act. So we're keeping track of this provision in particular throughout that process. And so as soon as it got passed, we, like Emily, started to really try to understand it so that we could apply for our own organization and help our members learn about that as well. And we've also been, and I'll talk later about how we've really been advocating for philanthropy to really center equity in this whole response to COVID-19, because we have a real concern that and these inequities that already exist and who gets funding and doesn't will just be exacerbated in response to this crisis. And when you look at the steps they have for applying for an SBA 7A loan through the Paycheck Protection Program, the first step is contact your SBA lender. Well, if you're a nonprofit who doesn't have a relationship, well, how do you even start that? I mean, the very first step was like, that's going to cut people off right away. So I immediately had concerns about that and how our nonprofit organizations, particularly smaller ones who don't know, because this again is, we fought for inclusion of nonprofits in this program, and that's good. But as Emily said, it's typically businesses who are applying for these things. So the whole system is skewed to being equitable towards nonprofits, and particularly smaller nonprofits, in my view. And so and what's also concerning is that my understanding from at least some of the lenders is that they're only processing loans for clients they already have. So if you're not already, if the bank you use for your checking account and money market as a nonprofit is an SBA lender, it's going to be even harder for that to happen. So we are really there's a call out, independent sector has a call out right now, a letter anyone can sign on to call for the financial institutions to address this issue in a serious way. So to create access to all nonprofits. So there's a movement starting now in the sector to make that happen. But it's a big challenge in my view that we have to overcome together. And also perhaps there's going to be a number 4, a CARES Act 2, where it can be addressed perhaps in a deeper way as well.
And I like what you said about overcome together. I think the importance of these times when we do have the availability, even though we have social distancing, that we can come together virtually and we can have these kinds of discussions about what are the problems we're seeing with it, how is it not working, who can then address it, and then how can nonprofits get the information about changes. Because What we've already seen is one thing will come out and then it will change. Because It's based on speaking out and listening and speaking out and listening and making those modifications. And that's a really, really valid point. Emily, thank you for, first off, taking one for the team and going in and trying to do that application so you could speak to it. But then also, Dave, for your continued guidance in having these conversations with the types of people who are in those pivotal roles of being able to make adjustments or suggest adjustments or they have the ears of the people who need to make the adjustments. Beth, you're kind of on the focal end for the nonprofits.
In the trenches.
To be able to turn and say, so what changes are available that I have access to? So walk us through, again, I'm going to refer back to this Google Docs because you're the gardener of the Google. So where will they be able to find the types of changes that may be coming through? Where are you going to post that?
Probably right on the top. Right now, I changed the link from the webinars that are now out of date just to the organization's COVID-19 pages or their top page. And actually, Emily, or others here, Ed, if you have a suggestion of another organization that should be at that top list, put it in. That's the way I've been working. What I've been seeing a lot in like Facebook groups of nonprofits and listservs and places where nonprofit folks gather and talk about these things, aside from a lot of complaints that it's not equitable, it's written for businesses, I don't have a relationship with that particular banker, a lot of anger around that, but a lot of mutual aid and help. Someone would say, "Oh, I tried this, and this is how I got through to my banker. And my banker did this for me. Maybe your bank, you should ask your banker X, Y, Z." So there's a lot, in an absence of having probably a helpline that's accessible from somebody, and guidance on the application. There's
not a bad idea, really. I mean,
you'd probably be on hold for days, but.
Oh God, no, let's not say that. Yes.
If I could respond to that, Beth, two things. I want to be really clear. Those resources, the National Council of Nonprofits and Independent Sector, are excellent resources. Yes. And they are updating their websites constantly. The fact that their webinars are out of date, they were responding to what they knew now. So
Absolutely.
They are still phenomenal resources. Right. Secondly, one piece of advice I would do in terms of the banking relationship, and we're advising nonprofits, reach out to your board members. Your board members are applying for many of them.
Two thumbs up for me here.
Yes. Yeah.
They're funding as well. So they can help you. Many nonprofits have a bank, but many nonprofits do not have a banker. We did not have a banker, a person. It was our board member that happened to be banking with the same bank that introduced us, and we discovered we had a person. So your board can be very helpful for nonprofits at this time.
Yeah.
You're talking about collaboration, and I really want to move into something where Dave has been instrumental in being a part of this changing framework of philanthropic giving. What does that look like? I mean, there are IRS parameters and all the stuff that we can or don't have to go into. But Dave, I wanted to talk with you about something you posted on LinkedIn recently, which was a pledge signed by, and I want to get this correct, 460 at the time, foundation leaders nationally, a pledge to loosen restrictions on grantees, to be as flexible as possible. So talk about what that means, and what have you heard from this pledge about the action that may come from it?
Sure. Yeah, happy to talk about that. There was actually two things that we've done, well, three things, but there's the pledge that's being hosted at the Council of Foundations to encourage all foundations to consider loosening their restrictions, being more flexible with the grantees. And then last week, the Forum, United Philanthropy Forum, along with 8 of our other National Philanthropy Association colleagues, issued a joint statement encouraging all funders to consider a significant increase in their grant grant levels and their giving levels right now to respond to this crisis. As you mentioned, this is unlike anything I've ever experienced in my lifetime, and it's unprecedented, and it calls for philanthropy to be unprecedented in its response. So there are a number of things we call for in terms of the giving. We, as folks may know, foundations typically, according to the law, have to give at least 5%. If they have an endowment, 5% of that. And most stick to that. So what we are calling for is for all foundations to consider a notable increase in that percentage this year, because it's so, as Emily just laid out, you said each of those 6 things she laid out, any one of them is just an overwhelming challenge. And for nonprofits to be facing all of them and others at the same time, we are going to risk losing some really valuable nonprofits that are essential to our communities. And people are suffering, and the suffering's just starting. So in our view, that calls for foundations to give more than they may be comfortable with, take a risk, give above that 5% level. There's not a target level we're asking, but there have been some foundations who doubled their payout this year. There are others who are, I know, considering that. It may not be a doubling, but increasing to 6% or 7%. So we're asking all funders to do that. We're asking them to do other things that will be very helpful to nonprofits dealing with all these issues, such as giving more general operating support that doesn't have all the reporting requirements and there's a lot more hoops you have to go through for a project program grant. And if you have a current project program grant with a nonprofit, convert it to general operating support. Make the reporting just easier right now. A nonprofit has so much they have to deal with. Just really streamline that as much as you can. Rapid response funding, a number of funders are just giving rapid response grants right now to their grantees above what they're funding. So here's some money this year to do with what as you need. You know best how to do it. The nonprofits know best how to use the money. So don't put any restrictions on how they should use it. They're the ones that know best how to do that, and trust in them. So there are those kinds of steps that we're encouraging all funders to take. In the pledge that you mentioned, over 500 foundations, last I looked, have signed on to it. It's great. We've seen a lot of foundations step up. We need a lot more to step up as well and follow their lead.
So let me ask you this, then. I'm trying to put on my nonprofit hat because my foundation hat was taken off too, and I've got multiple questions for you on that. But first, hitting the one that may be occurring with a lot of nonprofits watching this, what's the process or the procedure for them to know which of those foundations or the funders have already signed that pledge, and see, this is where you get into the conundrum. Do the nonprofits reach out to the foundations? Do the foundations let it be known to the nonprofits they're opening up more, they're offering additional grant monies? What does that look like?
Well, I would say yes and yes. COF.org is where the pledge is. If you go to COF.org, you find the pledge, and you can easily read the actions that they're asking funders to consider. So a nonprofit can go. One of the things we ask is that if every foundation, if they haven't reached out to their grantees, they should reach out to all the grantees and say, what's going on? What do you need? How can we help? And if your funder does that, be honest with them and say, this is what I need right now. This is what's happening. And don't be afraid, don't hold back. Just tell them what's going on. And if your funder if you have a grant with a funder and they haven't yet reached out to you, I would say reach out to them and say, just checking in, wanting to let you know, here's some things we're dealing with, and here's how you can help if you want. And we've seen, and refer to the pledge if you want. We've heard that a lot of funders are converting, project grants to general operating grants. Would you consider that for us? I mean,
I just want to jump in because I think what you've just said about reach out to them just to see, because these are unusual times, usually the standard protocol is a nonprofit doesn't reach out to a grantor. It's that you go to their website, you look at what their parameters are for making grants, and then you go forward. And I think we have to walk a line between all of a sudden thousands of nonprofits calling a funder, right? Mm-hmm. And knowing that if there is an opportunity for what your organization or what your foundation supports or what you as a funder support, then we really need some additional help. So that's another one of those processes that is kind of turned all sorts of ways with this new scenario that we're in.
Yes, it has. And that's part of the point, that things from the funder side and the nonprofit side, let's have a relationship that's different maybe from in the past, and we need to be doing things in a different way. And Emily, I would love to hear your perspective on this.
I love that she's so polite.
I was just about to dive in, Dave. It's interesting. The two things. First of all, I think that's absolutely wonderful, and certainly we're hearing a lot of funders doing that here in the Tampa Bay area. And pointing back to our survey for a minute, one of the things that nonprofits are very worried about on a long list, but is relevancy, continued relevancy to funders, because what they're worried about is funders turning away from maybe their mission. So I'm just going to use an example of the arts. Well, people need food and shelter. Funders who would typically fund the arts, possibly turning away. What we're, first of all, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but one more comment is that we're encouraging nonprofits to keep the lines of communication open. If they care about your nonprofit enough to invest in them, they will continue to care. And secondly, it's okay if you don't have all the answers. It's just important to let them know how you are moving forward and who you are serving and taking care of them. So I just wanted to kind of add that in from my corner.
Yeah, and I love your Beth one too. But absolutely, the relevancy issue is important, and that again is partly behind the call to consider increasing your giving levels. It's not that we want you to take from these groups, and give to these groups. It's to increase your giving so you can give more. Bigger. Yeah, make the pie bigger, and so.
Agreed.
So let me, and then Beth, I know you were going to put something in, and I just wanted to follow up real quick with the foundation aspect of that too, is that there are certain, and so let me ask you this, Dave, are you hearing anything from government, specifically IRS regulations with the excise tax? Are there any kind of parameters that are being loosened or that are being discussed for foundations? Because foundations were created for sustainability, for perpetuity, but then also there are times like these that foundations were created for to be able to help the sustainability and perpetuity. So that draws that age-old question, is the foundation here to sustain itself or to sustain the nonprofit sector? What is it? Have you heard any conversations with the government?
Well, not yet specifically about that. I mean, foundations can certainly, within the law, increase their payout, and I think that there's some really specific legal things I don't want to get into around that. But
Sure.
I think, in my view, and it's expressed in our statement, I mentioned, the top priority is to help your communities and help the people you care about. And that's the priority, if the top priority is just preserving your endowment capital, and I feel like in these times, that should not be the top priority. Obviously, you need to, if it's supposed to exist in perpetuity, you can do that, even if if your endowment level goes down a bit, it's still existing in perpetuity. So I just I personally don't think that should be the number one consideration right now.
Beth, were you going to jump in on something?
Oh gosh.
I didn't know if you were, I'm just coming to you just in case you were, because I was going to move us into a different direction. But
I was going to say a lot of the resources that you mentioned, plus others around like what foundations are doing. I've seen roundups by state, by local communities. A lot of people have added links to those that are in the resource guide. Not that it's the be all end all place to go for information. There's also, I'm seeing lots of other interesting models of mutual aid. And organizations getting support from unusual places. One example, and this has to do with the donation of medical supplies, where people there's peer-to-peer giving. Like if you have a box of N95 masks, like a lot of us do here in California because of the fires, you could donate directly to a healthcare worker. So there's a lot of like interesting kind of mutual aid types of grassroots type of support that I'm seeing bubbling up, in addition to regular philanthropy. And then a lot of advice, a lot of resources that are being written about like how do you talk to your individual donors, what's the kind of messaging, what are the talking points, to continue that, because it's, there's foundation resources, which are of course really important, but there's also support from corporations, whether it's
Right.
in kind, there's volunteer support, there's goods and services that are being donated, and then there's also individual support. Another interesting model I've seen crop up on GoFundMe, of all places, there's nonprofit. Those came up before the CARES Act was passed, but it was nonprofit relief funds, where so it's more of a crowdsourced way to raise some money to cover
Right.
some of the salary needs.
Yeah. And I'd like to just add this two other things. One, around the government funding, or other sorts of funding. Another thing a lot of our members are doing, particularly regional philanthropy organizations, is they're partnering with their state governments to make sure the government's doing its part as well, and doing it in the best possible way, because that's the government funding is much bigger than the philanthropic funding. And also, back to the point of increasing giving, if a foundation board gets together and they consider whether or not to increase their giving, and because of their giving philosophy or their financial situation, whatever, they decide to not do that, I respect that. I may not agree with it, but I respect it. But to not even have, we ask all founders to have that conversation and please consider this. And if you haven't yet done that with your board, please do that. So I just want to add that point to that call I talked
No,
about.
I think that's wonderful, and I like what I'm hearing from all three of you, which I think is significant. We've been talking in the sector for at least 10 years about collaboration and how we had been such a siloed community, and that's true for both nonprofits within one small community, and then also from the national standpoint of foundations funding different things, and it has created a little bit of a competitive, well, I'm trying for this and I'm trying for that. But this is an opportunity for everybody to really communicate, to have those conversations from the local to the national level of how can we come together to serve our United States community and where those areas of need are. So I'm going to segue into a specific area of need, which is how do we then really put an emphasis on equitable philanthropy, and what that looks like, from knowing that while every nonprofit has constituents in need, there are some that are, Dave, you shared an article again on LinkedIn, early data shows coronavirus infecting and killing Black people at alarming rates. How do we get the information to funders and foundations about what our nonprofit is doing to meet those specific areas, and how are foundations having those conversations, or grant makers, about equitable giving?
Mm-hmm.
It's a big question.
Well, I will say 2 weeks ago, you can go to unitedphilforum.org. We issued a joint statement from over 60 of our members calling for philanthropy to center equity in their response. And I think the communities that already are have inequities in terms of how they're being supported, how they're being funded, are being hit even harder now. So I would ask all funders to really, one thing is invest in people of color-led organizations who are serving the communities that are being hit very hard, and fund them more. These are grassroots organizations, often smaller organizations. Even if you haven't funded them before, I would encourage funders to find those organizations in their communities and support them, because they need everyone needs the funding, but they really need the funding now more than ever. So that's one thing that that funders can do, and also to think about organizations, that are serving the people who cannot work from home, who have to go in still every day. There are organizations and who've been really hard hit by closing of hotels and restaurants. There are a lot of funds out there to sort of, help restaurant workers and hotel workers, and seek those out in your community and support those as well, because that's where some of the inequities are hitting really hard right now, in my view.
Yes, Emily.
Waving again. A great response, Dave. I have something to add to that too. We're convening our CEOs. This is kind of a time when it's never been lonelier at the top for a nonprofit CEO. So we're convening our CEOs virtually to have them help each other with issues and help however we can. And one thing that we've suggested to them, that what works for funders, it works for communication with boards, when so many decisions are emotional these days, is to provide data. Provide data on those audiences that are being underserved or being marginalized. Provide data on what work you're doing. We provided data to one of our funders that 66% of the attendees for one of the free webinars we did were their providers. That was incredibly motivational, shall we say, for them. So when everyone's emotions, because it's affecting everyone in some way, can cloud an issue, reach out and find these national resources that everyone, Beth and Dave and everyone's talking about here, and use that data to communicate and motivate with your board and your donors.
That's awesome. And Beth, I see you diligently taking notes.
No, I was just writing notes because it was sparking some ideas, and I'm thinking about.
Awesome.
I've been working on this as an advisory member of an organization called the Leadership Learning Community, and they sort of sit at the center of equity and leadership and well-being. And so we were working on a network project for a large funder around a culture of health. And part of that project had an innovation fund where a lot of these community groups, social justice groups that are smaller, could apply for grants for, around the original intent of the grant. But we've been able to pivot that to have it be, what is your organization's leadership response to serving your community? And so it's not, and it's, the innovation grants are very, they're not, it's what you tell us what you think is the best response, and very easy to apply and get it. And then they're also capturing what they're learning about it, so they can so responses can be iterated upon to further the needs. But it's the people in the community who are stepping up and who are closest to it, who are able to come up with the solutions.
Mm-hmm. Right. And also I would just, that is great. And that's exactly the kind of pivoting that funders need to be doing. And think there are other groups that are particularly hard hit. People experiencing homelessness, people with HIV/AIDS and other issues that compromise their immune systems, immigrants and refugee communities. So also seek out the nonprofits serving those groups right now. They need extra help.
While you guys were talking, I was also sharing, Dave, on your page, you have another article that is about support for Native American families impacted by COVID-19. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for that too. And just as a potential thought, Beth, not to make your garden any bigger than it already is, but if there's and maybe another tab for those types of equity articles or things.
It's in there.
Is it? Well,
there you go.
It's at the top. In fact, it was up it's right after the health information before the fundraising, anything else.
Awesome. Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah. And I also just want to add, I mean, we are also really in our call for equity, we ask all funders to really pay attention to what's happening in the Asian American Pacific Islander communities right now. They are really, the hate crimes with those groups have really skyrocketed. And so there are also funders looking to direct money to address this really critical issue as well. So really want to lift that up. One of our members, Asian Americans Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, is taking a leadership role with that in the philanthropic sector.
That's awesome. And Dave, are you going to continue? Because you're one of my, I follow you on LinkedIn, but you're one of my go-tos where I'm like needing information, and I continue to get such excellent articles from you. So I want to let people know to look for Dave Biemesderfer on LinkedIn and follow you.
follow us three. You'll get
all three of you. Yes, absolutely.
You'll get good info.
But I wanted to ask this. It's a really big one of those. What do you call it when you have a big hairy idea? The BHAG.
BHAG.
What audacious goal? What about a national organized disaster relief fund that is a communication tool between foundations and nonprofits and other resources? Is that a possibility? Is it just a grandiose idea that keeps flashing into my head? Because I see this, like you're saying, Emily, the SB7A doesn't meet the needs right now, but that's also government funding. But what about foundations offering 0.5% of their asset base to this, or whatever that looks like for them to create this, and then have somebody who could deploy that money equitably to organizations in need. I'm just throwing it out there. Does it sound crazy? Everybody's like, holy cow.
I wanted to just point out, I mean, you may know, and Emily knows this, you all know it. I mean, there are a lot of relief, disaster, COVID response funds that have been created all around the country. Go to our website, probably, in Beth's resources. There's a place you can go to find out where they are.
Giving Compass.
Giving Compass, and NCFP's got a map, and they're updating them constantly. There's more and more of them being created around the country. So there are resources like Giving Compass you can go to find the ones in your community. And so I would stay on top of that for sure. I don't know about a national fund.
The feasibility is huge, and we're trying to meet so many needs. Yeah.
If you're talking about disaster, I think the other point is that there's going to be, we're in the response mode now. There's going to be, relief, recovery. There's going to be long-term needs as well. So we have to be keeping those in mind too, as we think about, directing philanthropic resources. It's not that we don't fund the response right now, but hopefully there can be maybe some funds created for that more long-term recovery. Might be more where there can be more of a national effort. Perhaps.
Or even a local, a very focused, localized, kind of, and I think we're seeing more and more of that as we're struggling through this initial phase of how do we make these responses, just like the three of you being on this call. I'm sure you've each all had other calls with other organizations about how can we collaborate and pull together in this time, and how do we focus that information then and get it out into the nonprofit sector as a whole, because oh my gosh, there's so many people asking so many questions.
Yeah.
And if I could add, we do have a local example. Dave, you may have seen this, the Resiliency Fund. That's $1 million fund that four funders came together to create very quickly here in the Tampa Bay area. And they're being very smart about it too. They pooled their money and they're allowing people to give to it. So again, bigger than any one of their missions, but focused on resiliency and response here in the Tampa Bay area. So wanted to give a shout out to them.
And thank you for telling us. That's exactly what keeps going through my mind of, really harnessing our philanthropic activities all together like that. That's fantastic.
That's happening around the country.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's happening here in San Jose too. The county put together a fund because we have Google and big tech corporations that are in our backyard. So they've put together, it's government and corporations donating to our local recovery fund.
But I think, to your original question, Louanne, it calls for innovation, because we've said a few times that we've never experienced anything like this, and we haven't. When we had Katrina, our country pulled together, but that was one part of the country.
Right.
This is all over the country and all over the globe. In 2008, we had the economic crisis. Now we've got that plus a healthcare crisis layered on top of it. So I think ideas like people should keep bringing up ideas like you did, and even if they've never been done before, it calls for that, in my view. And
speaking about innovation, and it's like more in the programmatic. My husband, who's now co-working with me, works in IT at a big hospital, and I've been amazed at all of a sudden having, not the actual healthcare workers, but all the support people who all of a sudden have to work at home and have to pivot like that.
Right.
And then to put protocols in place for really interesting things like how can they use technology to avoid infection if they don't have protective gear. So they have virtual rounds, giving the patient iPads and the doctor's iPads so they can communicate. Special remote controls for the respirator so that there's, lessening the contact. Putting up a bot for people who have the mild symptoms so they can go through a self-assessment and kind of reinforcing the message, don't come into the ER, and giving them advice, which then frees up kind of healthcare workers' time who need to attend to the more sick patients. But so I think if there's a blessing in this or a silver lining that of all the innovation that's happening and that will hopefully continue to happen.
That's fantastic. And talk about innovation. I know Emily has a free grant writing. It has to be virtual that Blake Colvin is doing. Yes. So if your nonprofit's needing that, again, I'm going to post links in the YouTube discussion phrase. Feel free to share this with whomever. I know I want to be respectful of your time. This is taking a moment out to talk about where we are right now. And like you've all said about last week's webinars, this one may who knows what it's going to look like in 4 days, right? So, but for now, I wanted to personally thank each of you, Emily, Beth, Dave, for joining us back on this special edition of the Philanthropy Show. We're bringing it back after 3 years of being retired, and just to be able to have the opportunity to talk about what's going on. Like I said, I want to share links as appropriate, and just ask you right now, do you have any last thoughts for any nonprofits or any foundations before we wrap up?
I do, Louanne, if I may, and this I will attribute to Steve Zimmerman. We did a webinar last week with him and on sustainability versus survivability, and I wrote this down and I keep it in my office to keep my thoughts focused, and the quote was, for us to ask ourselves, what can I do today to build a better future for my organization and for the community? So we're in such response mode that we also need to be thinking about the future and how to build our organizations to serve our community.
Very nice.
Wonderful. I'll just end by encourage everyone to take care of yourself. And there is, as you said, a lot going on. Things are changing hourly. A lot of stress, a lot of new ways of working. And so, but also take care of yourself, because you aren't going to be able to help your nonprofit, your organization, if you don't stay healthy yourself.
Right. And I'm going to echo that, having written a book on that topic.
Okay.
And one thing I've been recommending is for leaders to ask themselves like 5 questions. And one is like, how am I getting outside today? How am I moving my body? How, what expectation of normal am I letting go with today? And I'm okay around that. What beauty am I connecting with or creating for others? Who am I checking in on? And finally, my favorite is, what rainbow am I going to eat today?
Oh.
And not just literally fruits and vegetables, they're hard supply, but like looking about here in my neighborhood in San Jose, what all the parents have done, because they have young kids, they've gotten the rainbow colored chalk out and they're drawing rainbows on the sidewalk. And I see parents out walking their kids and they're counting rainbows.
Mm.
So let's like try to, I know it's hard to, what rainbows am I seeing for tomorrow?
I love that. So thank you guys very much. Thank you for joining us for the Philanthropy Show. We wish you health, we wish you happiness, and we'll see you on the other side of COVID.
Thank you.